Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Climate Innovation Summit. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Michael Mainelli. I'm one of the directors of Zien, and we run, for example, the Green Global Finance Index and created the London Accord many years ago, as well as work with the World Conservation Monitoring Center, etc. But what I'm here today to do is to moderate the great debate. Can self-reporting ever be effective for investors? And before I introduce the debate, normally at conferences like this, somebody stands up here and lectures you about your mobile phones. I'm no exception. I'd like you to get your mobile phone out, please. Please take it out of your pocket, pass it to the end of the road, drop it in the bucket of water. No, sorry. Take your mobile phone out, and you'll look up here and you'll see slido.com. We're going to have some interactive voting. I've tried it out. It's pretty simple. You go to slido.com on your browser, and you type in CIS #18. Now, while you're doing that, it means you don't have to stare at me, which makes it easier for me to talk. What I wanted to cover really was basically tonight, in the short time that we have available, we'd like to liven things up. So you can talk about the Battle of the Giants, you can talk about the Clash of the Titans, you can talk about the Gossip of Champions. So tonight we're going to see what people feel about some particularly important topics to do with self-reporting. And I'd like to inject a little bit of energy into this debate because nothing, in effect, generates discussion like a good dispute. And we have up here today a team on the left who are, yes, self-reporting can be effective, and we have a team of naysayers here on the right who say no. It was interesting as well, in the plenary just before this, Nancy made a point that are we so busy trying to make green and clean companies prove that they're green and clean, that we're actually hampering them being green and clean. And I hope that some of that will come out tonight. So let's have a quick look at our teams. Information's in the pack, but I'll start over here on the affirmative side. We have Isabelle Laurent, Deputy Treasurer and Head of Funding at EBRD, with a background in Treasury and Trading. Next to her is Andreas Hoepner. Sorry, excuse me. Next to her. I'm very good at this stuff, aren't I? Next to her is Hanna Waltsgott, who's responsible investment analyst with Kempen Capital Management, with real focus on low-carbon benchmarks. Hanna has got a great career here and is going to be really, I think, presenting the investor point of view. And then we have, coming from the academic side, Andreas Hoepner, Professor of Operational Risk, Banking and Finance at UCD here in Dublin. So that's the affirmative team. And here, the naysayers, the negative team. We have Jakob Thoma, Managing Director with 2D, I always get this one wrong, 2DII. And he's going to, yes, you got me there every time. And he's got a background here in scenario analysis. Next, we also have Manuel Coslier, who has got a background in portfolio investment and on energy transmission. And finally, Dylan Tanner is here about mapping really the concentrations and correlations, and some really interesting slides outside on the influence map, which I must say I found most enjoyable. Right, now, what we'd like to do, if we could, is to get some information about you. So our first question, up here behind us, should be coming up. From which sector are you? Financial, NGO, government, academic, or other? And I'll give you about 15 seconds, if I can, just to have a quick look at that. So, shifting wildly here as people make up their minds. Okay. Well, it looks as if we're just over 40% other. So hopefully when we get to the Q&A, you can identify who you are, where you're from, and what other means. I'd like to ask the second question, if I could. How many of you think current financial self-reporting contributes to managing future and current climate impact? A 1 is doesn't contribute at all, and a 5 is contributes a lot. So 1 on the left doesn't do very much, current financial self-reporting, and on the right it contributes a lot. Ooh. Seem to have quite a skeptical audience so far. Give you another couple of minutes. Nope, a couple of seconds. Great. Looks there like a skeptical audience for sure. And then finally, our third and most important question, the debate question tonight, can self-reporting ever be effective for investors? And you've got to just come off the fence here. Yes or no? Can self-reporting ever be effective for investors? Yes or no? Okay, yes, no, okay. We're running about 60-40. So I would like all those who'd answered yes to please cheer your team on the left. Let's hear it. Yay, yeah, come on. Good fight here. And all those who are against it to cheer your team here on the right. No. Good stuff. So there's a bit of energy already here. Now, I'm the moderator. The origin of the word moderator, the etymology, is to keep you within bounds. That's my job today. What are the bounds? Well, KIC, knowledge, innovation, and community. So knowledge, I want it punchy, on time. I'd like to make some intellectual points and pithy. Innovation, let's make some positive suggestions here about what could be done. If it was all perfect, we wouldn't be having this debate. And finally, community. I'd like us to have some fun. Let's keep it within bounds a little bit, mostly because we have to spend 2 more days together. So let's ensure that we end this on a friendly note. The teams have been reminded repeatedly that they have 3 minutes and 3 minutes only per person, and that's to give you time to make some comments. So I hope that you respect that when it comes to your turn, and it's not 3 minutes for you, it's under 30 seconds. So here we go. I'd like to ask, if I could, for the affirmative, could I please ask Isabelle to begin?
Thank you. Self-reporting is effective for investors in the green bond market. Issuers in 51 nations have raised $400 billion of outstanding bonds aligned with the green bond principles to finance green assets in even more countries, including many emerging markets. These principles have established the level of transparency about the assets to be funded, including their ex-ante benefits, co-benefits, and risks. The issuer must also articulate how such assets fit into the overall sustainability objectives, strategy, and processes to reduce greenwashing risk. While reporting of use of proceeds is a core requisite, impact self-reporting is encouraged but not required in recognition of the significant associated costs. Even for EBRD, external review of the impact of each asset would be prohibitively expensive. Our green bonds fund 383 projects in 32 countries with an average loan size of 10 million euro. And yet, investors, including dedicated green funds, have benefited from significantly greater transparency, as well as a more in-depth dialogue with issuers, ensuring that debt markets perform their key role in contributing to environmental sustainability and the transitioning of issuers' businesses. Green bond issuers are encouraged to report GHG emissions data only when they can provide full transparency on the applicable GHG accounting methodology and assumptions. Investors want as much disaggregated information as practically feasible, and given the importance of the geographic context in the assessment of solutions, disclosure on the local and regional context and specific baselines are encouraged to understand the impacts of each project in its context. There is often a misconception that validated quantitative reporting would direct investors to green bonds that fund projects estimated to provide the largest CO2 savings, thereby implementing investment strategies for a 2-degree scenario. Quite apart from the reality that such a scenario is ill-defined, with different countries having disparate NDCs, it is not a given that a low-carbon pathway is determined by the biggest delta in CO2, and there may indeed be a greater importance in the future on technologies that do not provide significant CO2 savings. The credit crisis underlined the importance of investors performing their own credit analysis, rather than relying on credit rating agencies. The same should be true for investors' assessment of environmental benefits. Self-reporting, including the risks, co-benefits, context, and underlying assumptions, is and should remain effective for investors in holistically assessing the quality of green assets. Thank you.
Let's cheer it. And excellent timing. Now, from the negative side, Manuel is going to kick off. What's wrong with all that?
The most important thing for self-reported data by companies to be used by investors is obviously to be aggregated and to be harmonized, so that the investors is able to have a sense of what his investment's impact is. And even if we take the most urgent issue, which has been mentioned earlier, which is climate change, and in climate change, if we take the most well-known and most used metrics, which is carbon footprinting, it is impossible for an investor now to be able to aggregate data so that it has a sense at the level of his investment of what its impact is. In other words, if an investor wants to carbon footprint his portfolio, he needs to get data from companies which could be reported on different boundaries with different assumptions using different standards. It could be reported on scope 1 or on scope 2 or on scope 3 maybe sometimes. Even if it's reported on scope 3, it could be reported in different categories of scope 3 with different assumptions and with different standards, which makes it impossible for the investor to be able to aggregate the data in the right way at the level of his investment. So these framework of different standards and assumptions make it really impossible for an investor to use the self-reported data by companies as an output for reporting purposes, and it makes even less sense to use it as an input to an investment strategy. Let's say that an investor would want to create a low-carbon portfolio, for example, by using self-reported data by companies, and if the data is not reported in the same way by every company, even in the same sectors, building a low-carbon portfolio or investment strategy based on this data wouldn't make any sense from a climate change perspective. And if I may add to the question, I know that the question is, can self-reporting from companies ever be effective for investors? It should be effective in time, so it shouldn't be too late before it's ever trustworthy for investors.
Excellent. Pithy and pointed. Now we're going to have 2 rebuttals before we turn to you, and then the final members of each team will mop up at the end and try and convince you to change your vote. Hanna.
Can self-reported data ever be effective for investors? Yes. Investors already base many of their decisions on self-reported data. Financial statements contain self-reported data. And though financial statements may not be perfectly efficient yet, they are effective enough for investors to be used. So what is it that we can learn from self-reported financial data? We can increase reliability and accuracy of data when 4 governing mechanisms are in place. 1, reporting has to be a requirement. 2, according to a sound standard that allows for comparability. 3, the process of the companies arriving at the data has to be verified by an independent party. And 4, there need to be incentives both for the organizations as well as for the individuals within to report accurate and reliable data out of self-interest. And if I talk about self-interest, I mean basic economics, market forces that pose legal risks, financial risks, reputational risks. So let's take an example. If investors do not trust information presented in an annual report, there will be perceived information asymmetry. And information asymmetry is scientifically proven to impact the cost of capital. So if we talk about carbon data in specific, carbon taxes, permits, or emission trading schemes would make carbon data very relevant for the investors and hence create very strong incentives for companies to report better data. I've noticed that there are also quite some millennials in the room today, so let me put on my millennial hat too. We are getting into the age of big data and social media, and I think that reputation is increasingly difficult for companies to achieve and maintain. So I believe that corporates can get better access to human capital, such as talent, when displaying transparency and trustworthiness. So again, like my colleague on the other side said, the question may not be whether the data can ever be effective, but rather when it will finally be effective. Thank you.
We have some snappy debaters, and so the final rebuttal will come from the negative side. Jakob.
Thank you. The fact that the honorable debaters on the other side had to resort to the green bonds example shows the weakness of their case. Green bonds represent hardly 1% of bond markets, and indeed that 1% of green bonds is fraught with issues because it is not actually the reporting of the companies, and so there's a lot of evidence of greenwashing in the green bond space as well. So I think that's really just showing it. And the other case they made is the conditions just described that are required for it to be effective, which will never be met. Those 4 conditions are a pipe dream, a fairy tale of how the future should look and would look, and indeed the past 15 years of self-reporting advocates have tried to achieve that future with very little progress to date. So it's very important to recognize that, yes, self-reporting can be effective if unicorns fly through the sky. This is not the reality. What's more, even if it was the reality, let's suspend disbelief. It is just not the right format in the era of big data. As you rightly highlight, big data is growing and growing, and so the concept of having an annual report that you read in November 2018, that was written in May 2018 for data from 2017 is just not relevant. Time is too fast. The frequency of information, the way investment is done today, is just not done on a basis where data might be 2 or 3 years old by the time it reaches the investor desk. And indeed, I think one of the other issues is not just the frequency, but also the granularity. If you're thinking about climate policies, you need to know where those climate policies sit. Aggregated information at company level across 20, 30, 40, 50, hundreds of subsidiaries is not the right fly-by height for investors in a digital age that are using big data and algorithms. We have had the case of self-reporting regimes in France with Article 173. There is no comparability, and as my colleague rightly highlighted, this is one of the reasons why self-reporting doesn't work. I also want to encourage you to think about the reality of the faith that you yourself have in the system. I saw the pro side celebrating the fact that 60% thought self-reporting could be effective ever. 60% of the people that already decide to come to this conference. We already have the cheerleaders of climate change here today, and only 2/3 of you actually think self-reporting is an effective mechanism. Wait till you go outside. And so that reality is the litmus test by which we have to measure this. Effectiveness for mainstream investors, for changing global capital markets, for systemic change, which self-reporting will never be able to contribute effectively to.
I don't know about you. I felt the gloves coming off there. That was definitely moving. Right, and now it's over to you. We're going to take some rapido, 10 minutes worth of just quick comments on what's said there. I'm going to try and keep you to 30 seconds or so. And the first comment is from Tony Rook of CDP, who might know something about this.
Yes, so obviously I come from an organization. Hello. I come from an organization, CDP, where we've been getting companies to self-report for 17 years. I agree, it can do with improvement, but I think to the question of can it ever be effective, I mean, all reporting is self-reporting, whether it's financial, climate-related, or anything else, and you still base investment decisions on that. So dismissing it out of hand, I think, is wrong. Because it's already self-reported, and I think Hanna said that already for financial. The second point I'd like to say is we've had 17 years to try and get this right. Financial disclosures have taken thousands of years to get to the point where they are. So we're still in the process of actually perfecting that. And for example, this year we started asking about investment in low-carbon tech going forward. So I think that's a really important area that shows the direction of travel.
direction of travel. Can I see some more hands, people who'd like to comment? We've got 2 mics around here. Don't be shy. They're not. There we go, gentleman here, 4th row, 5th row. Keep your hands up if you want me to see you.
Hello, my name's Thomas from Influence Map. So one of the concerns that I've heard about green bonds is that a party can issue a green bond and then that money doesn't necessarily go to a green purpose. I was wondering if someone can speak to that. Or maybe rather, Jakob, would you have a solution to this problem?
I'll allow a quick response for a direct question. Jakob, very quick.
The solution is not to allow green bond issuers to issue green bonds for when it's general corporate purpose financing, and thus the entity and the money where the entity goes to can do whatever it wants, even if just a fraction of a percent is green. That would be the solution to prevent this greenwashing, is not allow general corporate bonds for non-green issuers.
Thank you. Got a question from a woman at the back? Oh, sorry, my apologies. Just
clarify that it wouldn't be a green bond. The absolute definition of a green bond is a bond where the use of proceeds is hypothecated to green asset purposes. And you either have to define the generality of what you're funding, so when you're EBRD and it's 380 odd projects, or if you're a corporate and it's just for one, you have to explain what that one is. But it's very specifically not use of proceeds for general capital purposes. That is not a green bond, and it's got to be written into the legal documentation.
Thank you very much for the clarification, both Isabelle and Jakob. Thank you. Woman back there?
Hello.
Can you stand up, maybe?
Yeah, thanks.
Great.
So Sarah Dubray, I work rather with cities and measuring their carbon emissions with sensors. Maybe one point that could go for against self-reporting is with the Paris Agreement, the countries and the cities themselves are going to have to report their emissions. So how do we make this territorial reporting fit together with all the companies reporting on their own footprint? Because at the end of the day, it's the same molecule in the air of GHG. So I suppose that we will need some kind of convergence between these different reportings.
And are you for or against the motion, ma'am?
Therefore, I'd be rather against self-reporting.
Against, okay. Over here, Dickie Whitaker, I recognize you. And are you for or against, Dickie?
I'm against.
Okay.
So I think that is a lovely idea, having voluntary reporting, but I think the point made about standards is a really important one. And I think if you try to think of anything in financial services, or possibly anywhere else for that matter, where voluntary has worked, where the outcome is important, I think the answer is very, very rarely does that actually happen. That doesn't mean that voluntary doesn't have a role. It's just that if we need something to happen, it has to be mandatory. It has to have common standards to make it work, I would suggest.
Okay, so a plea for mandatory. Gentleman here in the middle, and are you for or against?
Yeah, I'm against. My name is Oliver Marchand. I work for Carbon Delta. And one of the big issues we see with self-reported data is that while it's great that 5,000 companies already report to CDP, if you go into the details of Scope 3 reporting and the coverage, you actually see that there's only around 100 companies that report, a comprehensive Scope 3 report to CDP. And we see with investors that coverage is really a major issue. And I think we're very far in terms of Scope 3 reporting to be at any sort of coverage that would make sense for an investor.
Great. 60% of you are hiding, or I'm statistically sampling terribly. So I'd like to see some people who are for the affirmative stick their hands up and make a comment. Where were you? There we go. We've got a gentleman up here. You are affirmative, right?
I am, yes. It's much of a comment as it is a question. I guess in the age of sensors, you can try to quantify real numbers, but it's really hard to quantify the process part, which investors are also interested in. It's also about how much the company plans to do, aims to do. There's a lot of value in qualitative data people actually say, and what they're actually doing, that you can get even more valuable information. So my question is, how do you, address process through these big data questions that you plan to just get with sensors?
Okay, I can see the rebutters, closers getting ready. Some more hands. I'd still like to see one or two more affirmatives. It's a little under, there we go. Gentleman just behind you there, Rian.
Hi there. Look, you need to work this out. You need to have a system that works on its own. We can't have governments. Governments change all the time. But the caveat is we have gambling regulators, but we still have Gambling Anonymous. We have drinks regulators, but we still have alcoholics. So you have to find a way that you can be trusted to regulate yourself. I don't believe that. We believe that you could do it, but you have to find a way.
Okay. For those of you who like to slip in at the end, I'm just warning you, there's only about 5 more spots left. A woman there in the center, white jumper.
Thank you. Vicky Plater from the New Zealand Treasury. We're having some similar sort of discussions about what are some of the indicators of different dimensions of well-being that we think should be reported, so not necessarily just financial. Now, the reality is we don't know what that perfect set of indicators is, but we know that actually to be reporting on some of those will be better than to not be reporting on them at all, and it gives more visibility. Now, we need to do that with humility. We need to do that in a way that acknowledges that actually as we learn and get more information, we will be able to do better, but that's not a reason not to do it. And of course it would be better if everyone was doing it and you had more comparability, but that's not a reason to not start.
Okay, and just to confirm, you are affirmative, that's right?
Yes.
Good, just, it sounded that way. Okay, now we're a bit more balanced, so open floor here, gentleman here.
Yeah, Richard Davis, affirmative. Stephen Hawking said forever is an awfully long time, especially the bit just before the end. So the inclusion of the word ever in here suggests that the only answer to this can be yes.
Excellent, and sharp. Gentleman there in the center. Some more ladies' hands as well.
Hi, Emil from Matter Pension. We're building a sustainable pension product and a financial sustainability screening tool. I'm pro affirmative. I think we are right now discussing whether or not self-reporting can stand alone. And I think everyone agrees that it can't. But I think investors also need to take on the responsibility of triangulating the results that come in from self-reporting with big data, as Jakob is mentioning, data from exclusion lists, natural language processing from the debate and the discourse that's going on the internet. There's a lot of other ways to look at what companies are doing, and self-reporting is just one of the keys. So, of course, yes, it can be effective, but not in of itself would be my stance.
Kirsten, for or against?
Curious. I have a question. Self-reporting, if you relate it to the human systems we know well around, say, performance management, often struggles when it's, if you ask people within or working with any kind of system to report on their own performance and you don't triangulate that in any other way, you can get set into a number of really big distortions when you start taking decisions, which I think is the problem, the relationship between reporting and decision making. What about peer reporting? Is that being considered in self-reporting, where the self debates and triangulates with peers?
Excellent point. Some other hands then? We've got time for just 4 more comments. So some of those of you who are anti, ready to bolster your side? It's a little lopsided at the moment. Got a gentleman here at the back.
Thank you. Daniel Brooksbank from Responsible Investor. Any investors in the room? Could we ask, actually, any investors?
Hands up, investors, please.
There we go. That's my question and answer right there.
It was a big other, Daniel. It was a big other. Great. Any more comments or questions? Okay. I can see that we're all alcoholics. We want to get to the drinks. Okay. Right. Well, is it? Oh, sorry. There we go. Way at the back. My apologies, sir. It's quite bright up here.
Thanks. Just trying to keep you fit, running around. Just a comment then, a question, just being provocative, because that's my mandate. Financial Times issued an article the other day about disclosure of companies that say they have carbon goals and objectives, but behind the scenes they finance lobby groups that advocate against climate policy. So against, for that reason, because self-reporting is not transparent enough in the full disclosure of financial outgoings for organizations.
Okay, so against. I think we've reached a natural pause. I want to remind you, get your phones out because you'll be voting in 6 minutes. I've seen some copious notes being taken, and I think we'll now turn for our first close to the affirmative team, and I'd like to ask Andreas to lead.
Yes, I give you 3 points with 3 sub-points in 3 minutes. Why are we here? Because this is very important for planet Earth. What are we currently seeing? Self-reporting does not work in the vast majority of cases. But there is an ever in the question, and so that gives me the ability to create a vision. And this is really a how question, not a why or what, it's how, technical details. So what do we need? We need to change the incentives, and I'm looking at CDP directly, to change the incentive. They currently don't work, dear CDP people. Next, we need them verified by financially independent auditors, peers, governments, not someone who you can pay. Whenever you pay them, surprisingly, it gets better to you. And the third thing, and that comes to Jakob, is we need legal liability. We need scenarios where the self-reporting is legally liable for the organization and ideally the executive. And now I'm standing up to build a vision for you guys. So the first thing, Laurent asked me to give you a case that works. Look at the British Airways 2013 Sustainability Report. That is accurate greenhouse gas reporting, at least Scope 1 and Scope 2. Then the next thing, to my honorable German friend, there is a case where self-reporting works, is in the 10K in the SEC, and it's the risk section. If you as a company do not report material risk in your 10K to the US government, they will sue the hell out of you. And everybody is very, very afraid out of it. And actually, a lot of cases, legal cases, get settled just before the 10K deadline because that makes sure that you don't have to report it. And the most important thing, and please tell that to everybody, is where you have the biggest leverage on the companies. And the biggest leverage of the companies when you refinance them as investors, when you give them money to exploit natural resources, either fossil fuels or maybe more sustainable ones, for another 3 years, for another 10 years, for another 20 years, for another 30 years. Exxon refinanced themselves for 30 years in 2016 until 2048. And Coslier originally bought that. They later sold. So would you really want your pensions to refinance for 30 years without even having good self-reporting? In any bond contract, there are covenants. The normal covenants are about liquidity, which basically is just sound financial management. Put in a covenant and ask them to, at the minimum, report accurate Scope 1 greenhouse gas emission. That would make Manuel and my work on the tech much, much easier. Put in a covenant for other SDGs. As a vision, why don't you put in a covenant for SDG 5? Isn't it possible for a company to say, in 20 years, when that is repaid, I'm going to have a gender-balanced board. I'm going to have a top management that has a good gender balance. So to make self-reporting work, you have to put it in the covenants for the refinancing. That is the point where we have leverage. Daniel just asked how many investors are in the room. Not too many, but we can tell all the investors, we can tell all our pensions people, all of you guys are pension investors, put it in the covenants of the refinancing. Focus on the fixed income markets more than you focus on the equity markets. Thank you very much.
Dylan, the weight of the clash of titans falls on your shoulders.
So the issue here is materiality. Going forward is not the same as the past when it comes to climate risk. Investors need to be able to pick out the winners from the losers. And this is being able to understand management behavior, where the company is going. So at present, mainstream investors do this by external research and also by self-disclosure. I'm glad you've pointed out those conditions of self-disclosure that investors need to have reliance on that. It's legally binding, checked by a third party that is legally binding to that. It's in a format that's comparable, et cetera, et cetera. We don't have anything anywhere near this in climate risk disclosure. Nothing like. And the trajectory of moving to there is actually going down. We study lobbying for a living, and we've studied the lobbying of the moves to legalize that and put it in a framework. And companies will fight like hell against that. The companies who have the most to lose and the most to hide, Exxon and others, and they're under investigation right now by the US New York Attorney General, do not want this harmonized and legalized in the fashion which you will need to rely on, in your own words, to have self-disclosure work. So we're going to have to rely on a ream of external resourcing and research by qualified people in a competitive market to reach the level of materiality research that we need in the time frame allowed.
Wow. Good. Thank you. Well, I must say, everybody, you've done a great job at getting things out very short, sharp, and fast, and I hope the audience has appreciated it. Appreciate the audience comments, but the time of judgment has arrived. Maeve is now putting up on the display the question, can self-reporting ever be effective for investors? Please vote now. Ooh. Ooh. Gosh. Oh, no. I'm going to call it quits in a second, but wow, is this dramatic and exciting, you know? Who needs the Tour de France? We've got a race here. Oh. Wow, wow. Oh, gosh. Okay. Well, I think, Maeve, if you don't mind, we're going to close polling at this rate. I'm afraid it's come out to be extremely, extremely close, but I think in the tradition of who had the most swing on the swingometer, I think without question it goes to the negative here on the right, but it was certainly a close-fought debate. So could you please thank all of the panelists for that? Well, how do I sum this up? Well, I think the first thing was we kicked off over here on the affirmative with really, we've really got to get this moving. It helps us motivate the millennials and gets more information out there. And then we had a little bit of a shift there where we wanted to put a bit more hard liability behind that. And I think that is clearly the struggle here is there are forms of self-reporting that bite. I happened to sit for many years on the United Kingdom Accreditation Service. We're responsible for the ISO standards throughout the United Kingdom and about 3,500 laboratories. And that's it. There's a strong audit process in it, and it's a competitive market for that. Over here on the right, we had, well, it's just too messy. It's too narrow. I wrote down pipe dreams and too much focus on green bonds. And then the ones who want to hide will. So I thought these were some, pretty classic arguments. I mean, for me, I think that reporting, self-reporting or otherwise in this space is actually only a stepping stone to the future. And the future is when this is truly integrated into our financial system, and green is something that engineers do, but the normal for financial people is it's just one of many factors that features in the numbers. So I want to remove the externalities. And when people get a bit negative about it, one of the things I point out is that when it comes to economics in 2008, Americans drove 7% fewer miles that year. American mileage per person dropped markedly in that year. And it wasn't because they were finally listening to the Audubon Society or the Sierra Club, it's because the price of oil doubled. And so if we can get the economics right, the behaviors will follow, corporate and consumer. So I see this as a stepping stone to internalization. But that's my view. What I liked today was the variety of the debate. Hopefully it's something that puts a bit of energy into the rest of the conference and gets us chatting. I would encourage you to come up and talk to, or better yet, talk to them over a drink outside. But what I found today was really very similar to a line from The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Douglas Adams gives one of his characters, Vroom Fondel, the phrase, what we really need are rigidly defined areas of uncertainty and doubt. So I enjoin all of you to discuss those areas of uncertainty and doubt as we break.